Hi, I'm Patty Davis, and today we are going to take an in-depth look at euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide for the terminally ill. When I began this project, I didn't believe that euthanasia should be legalized. But now, after all this research, I believe euthanasia should be legalized for the terminally ill. So, what changed my opinion? What makes this topic so morally controversial? Let's begin. We're going to start with the general overview of euthanasia, and then we'll get into some important facts. The 4 types of euthanasia, and each of the viewpoints, pro-euthanasia and anti-euthanasia, as I mentioned earlier. Euthanasia comes from the Greek meaning good death, and it is just that, the intentional ending of life in order to relieve pain or suffering. And there are 4 main types: voluntary euthanasia, involuntary, non-voluntary, and passive euthanasia. It's important for you to know that for this broadcast, we will only talk about voluntary euthanasia, because to me, non-voluntary and involuntary are both simply seen as murder. At the same time, we don't need to get into passive voluntary because this is already legal. It is seen as the right to refuse treatment, the right to choose to take no action and die, or turn off life support. Meanwhile, involuntary is when it's performed against a patient's will. On the other hand, non-voluntary is when the patient is unable to make their informed consent, for example, in child euthanasia. Not a lot of people agree with both of these, and I am on the same page. So now, with voluntary euthanasia, there are 2 viewpoints, pro-euthanasia and anti-euthanasia, as I mentioned earlier. Pro-euthanasia is when you believe it should be legalized. Anti is the opposite. According to a manual, there are 4 main arguments presented by opponents of euthanasia. The first is that not all deaths are painful. The second, alternatives combined with the use of effective pain relief are available instead of euthanasia. The third is that the distinction between active and passive euthanasia is morally significant. And fourth ends with, legalizing euthanasia will place slippery slope, which would lead to unacceptable consequences, which I will talk about later. And then there are the arguments of pro-euthanasia proponents. And I'm not saying this is the greatest way to think, I'm just telling you that this is what I believe, and this is an opinionated broadcast. So, economically, according to CNN, 1 in every 4 Medicaid dollars goes to the 5% of beneficiaries in their last year of life. So one argument is that it makes economic sense. The second is that it improves the quality of life. During life, these patients no longer fear death because they get to choose when they die and how they die. Another is that we commonly argue it does not target the vulnerable, as many of people will say. It's strictly the patient's own choice. It does not devalue life in any way. The handicapped, the disabled, and the sick all can live great lives. It is up to them how they live their life, and I believe how they die, especially when it's terminally ill. As I mentioned earlier, the most controversial part of this issue brings up the slippery slope argument. I, myself, will tell you I don't believe it will lead to a slippery slope. This is when you allow patient A, so you have to allow patient B, and in turn you're accepting patient N. But I do not believe that's how it's going to happen. Annually, in the Netherlands, where it's legal, nearly 2/3 of patients who apply to be euthanized are refused. We're not accepting N and we're not accepting T. We will accept when it is needed for the terminally ill, voluntarily. In the United States, there was a study done in 2010 with 10,000 physicians that came to the result that only approximately 16% of these physicians would consider stopping life-sustaining therapy if their family demanded it, even if they believed it was premature. Meanwhile, 55% would not, and for the remaining 29%, it would depend on circumstances. This is where I find myself. Whether either of these studies sheds light on what will happen in the future with euthanasia, it is easy to say that something must be done. This country needs a definite stand on euthanasia. As of today, euthanasia is legal in 5 United States: Washington, Montana, Vermont, New Mexico, and Oregon. Patients in states where it's not legalized, so the other 45, have to move to Oregon or to Montana to get this treatment, which we see in Brittany Maynard's case. Brittany Maynard was a 29-year-old from Anaheim, California, a state where it was not legalized, and was diagnosed with the deadliest form of brain cancer and told she had about 6 months to live. She seeks YouTube to share her pro-euthanasia thoughts. Her family moved from California to Oregon, where it would then be legalized under the Death with Dignity Act. so that she could choose when she wanted to die and how she wanted to die. She's not the only one. Since 1997, 752 patients in Oregon have died under the state's euthanasia law. This case also brings up an anti-euthanasia argument that was put in a Texas Right to Life article in 2010. The article was titled Euthanasia: Devaluing Human Life. The article refers to a study published in the British Medicine Journal in October 2008 that showed that 26% of patients requesting assisted suicide in Oregon were depressed. For some reason, the article ended with, quote, "Compassion and counseling should be offered to suffering individuals, not lethal drugs," end quote. The main argument they made was that terminally ill patients who desire death were only depressed. But who are we to decide that a terminally ill should get compassion rather than lethal drugs? Brittany Maynard was not depressed. She actually said, quote, "I will enjoy however many days I have left on this beautiful earth. The reason to consider life and what's of value is to make sure you're not missing out. Seize the day. What's important to you? What do you care about? What matters? Pursue that and forget the rest." End quote. Does that sound like a depressed 29-year-old? I argue that terminally ill patients who desire death are not always depressed and cannot only be treated with compassion and counseling. So while euthanasia at the present time stays legal in 5 states out of 50, I hope you realize that something needs to be done. It is simply not right to have to move to a different state to get a law. This country needs a definite stand on euthanasia, and I believe it should be legalized. Thank you for watching, and I hope you learned a lot.